Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another session of Edgware United Synagogue's live-streamed adult education programme. This session was arranged a few days before the general election, which took place on the 12th of December. So it was arranged before we knew the result or had any idea of what the political landscape would look like at the beginning of June 2020. In September, it had been reported that 40% of British Jews would seriously consider emigrating if Corbyn became Prime Minister. And in November, just 7% of British Jews said they would even consider supporting Corbyn's party. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear how much may have changed since the change of leadership in the Labour Party and speculate whether in the future people who traditionally supported the left will return, and if they're activists, whether they feel that they will be in a safe environment. Our speaker tonight, Luke Akehurst, is in a unique position to lift the lid on the history and causes of Labour anti-Semitism, having had the dual vantage points of being at the heart of the party's decision-making and being leader of a pro-Israel campaign organisation. He will explore the historical roots of anti-Semitism on the left, the organisational pathway that saw it brought into the mainstream of the party and institutionally capture it, and the ideological basis of anti-Semitic variants of anti-Zionism, anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. He will also look at events since the general election, whether these constitute a turning point in the battle within the party and what the new leadership needs to do. Luke Akehurst has been director of We Believe in Israel since 2011. We Believe in Israel is a BICOM initiative and is a broad coalition of over 21,000 supporters of Israel. Luke is not Jewish, but has been a committed Zionist all his life. Outside of work, he was a Hackney councillor for 12 years, has stood for Parliament twice, and served on the Labour Party National Executive Committee. He is Secretary of Labour First, a network of Labour moderates. He was previously an award-winning director of global PR company Weber Shandwick. The topic on which Luke will address us tonight is what's going on in regard to Israel, Jews and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Afterwards, you will have an opportunity to ask him questions.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Great. Spencer, thanks for your kind introduction. And I don't need to explain who I am because that was very adequately covered. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to spend part of this evening with you. I've spoken as part of a panel before several years ago at Edgware United, but I haven't kind of had the stage just to myself before. So it's a pleasure to be with you, even in such unusual circumstances that we're having to do all these things online. I sincerely hope that all of you are well and coping with the strange situation we're all in, that we're all trying to make the best of a rather terrifying and odd situation and get on with our lives. This is obviously a very different talk to the one that I would have given if I'd given it before the 12th of December, and I did go around lots of synagogues talking about what was going on inside the Labour Party with anti-Semitism. So I'm going to skid through the pre-December stuff rather fast, but I'm happy to answer more detailed questions on it in the Q&A, so that I focus a little bit more on what's happened since, because it's more contemporary and more interesting. So just to do the speeded up version of what happened between 2015 and 2020 was that there were a set of people who had been fringe to the Labour Party, who had been there the whole time, and that suddenly, almost by accident, it wasn't even their own design, it was a series of accidents, led them to seize control of the country's largest opposition party. And the sad thing is, as someone that I identify with the centre left in politics, I deeply identify with the British Labour Party. Anti-Semitism on the left is not a new thing. It dates right back to the early days of socialism in the 19th century, Marx, even though he was a Jew, said some pretty stereotyping things about Jews and international finance and capital, etc. And it was identified as a phenomenon, an anti-Semitic variance of socialism in the 1880s by August Bebel, who was a German social democrat, who talked about the socialism of fools, by which he meant a sort of socialism that, rather than analysing how society worked, stereotyped capitalists and demonized them and portrayed them as Jews as being prevalent amongst the capitalist classes and being the people who were kind of conspiring to exploit the workers. So it's been there a long time. You then have an intermixing after the Russian Revolution of Russian Christian anti-Semitism gets mingled in through Stalin, but through other people in global communism as well, and you get all the kind of horrors of the way in which high Stalinism treated Jews, purging them, the gulags, etc., language about rootless cosmopolitans, fear about plots by Zionists, all kinds of pretty disgusting conspiracy theories. And then it gets a new injection of life with the creation of the State of Israel, and particularly after 1967, when the Palestinians get portrayed as a kind of oppressed minority, and the extreme variant of that starts to portray Jews as acting like Nazis, there being a global Jewish conspiracy that is stopping the plight of the Palestinians from being properly explored due to Jewish control of, or Zionist. They often insert the word Zionist instead of politics and finance. In the Labour Party, people with extreme hatred of Israel were there. There was a magazine called Labour Herald in the 1980s, edited by Ken Livingstone and John McDonnell, that published pictures, cartoons of Menachem Begin portrayed dressed as Heinrich Himmler. So they were doing the thing of comparing Israelis to Nazis. Even then in the 1980s, that's not a new thing. Jeremy Corbyn was the signatory on a statement of solidarity with the Palestinians in the early 1980s, calling for the expulsion of Polt Zion. So the expulsion of what's now the Jewish Labour movement from the Labour Party, on the basis that Zionists should all be expelled from Labour. So none of this is new. Came near to capturing control of the party in the 1980s. Then they're marginalised under Blair and Brown. And then Ed Miliband messes up and creates a new voting system for leader that incentivises mass recruitment at £3 a go in 2015. And something about Jeremy Corbyn chimes with enough people on the fringe of British politics that they pay their £3 in very large numbers and join. And his organisationally, his campaign was the only one that understood how to recruit people like that. And they used the base that they had built in extra parliamentary organisations, including both the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and the Stop the War Coalition, to do that recruitment. So the hard left, because it had been marginalised in the Labour Party under Blair, it went off and did single issue campaigns about the Palestinians, against war in the Middle East. These built up large email lists of people who were not necessarily Labour at all. They were Green or Socialist Workers' Party or just single issue people. And then in 2015, they emailed them all and asked them to click on a link and pay the £3 and come in and take over the Labour Party and put someone that agreed with their agenda in as leader. And this brings in a coattail of people whose anti-Israel feelings are so strong that they're anti-Semitic, or whose anti-imperialist feelings lead them to believe that Israel is an example of a kind of Western colony implanted on the Arab world, or whose anti-capitalism takes the form of that socialism of fools that I talked about. And then because these are people that organisationally are Jeremy Corbyn's fan club, so it's like it's worked on two levels. Three levels. He organisationally persuaded them to come in. His own political stances as a extreme anti-Israel person and a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign mean that they are infused and think they can say whatever they want about Israel and Jews. And then he doesn't believe in taking disciplinary action on anything because he thinks that chucking people out of the party is something that people like me do, or people like Tony Blair, and they're his allies. So why would he chuck them out? He needs their votes in internal party elections. And that's kind of how we get into the mess. And then it all becomes very public in 2016 and then again in 2018. And really, it's impossible for the hard left leadership of the Labour Party to take effective action against it because they'd be throwing out all of their own senior activists. And they might even, when you start looking at the wording of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, I'm pretty sure that Jeremy Corbyn, if you went through his past history, has said things that breach that definition. So adopting it was hugely problematic because it was basically saying we should probably be chucked out. The electorate then looks at these people on the 12th of December. And so for the Jewish community, it's a very specific existential thing of, well, we'd really like to stay in the UK and we don't feel very safe having a potential prime minister that appears to hate us and hate a country that we feel a deep personal affinity with. So we're not going to vote for you, or 93% of us aren't. And then lots of other people, it's part of the package that scares them about Labour. I mean, actually, if you were going to get specific about it, his reaction to the Skripal poisonings probably hit him worse in the opinion polls than anything about anti-Semitism. But it adds to the package of this doesn't look like the Labour Party of Clem Attlee or Harold Wilson or Tony Blair, and I'm pretty suspicious of having anything to do with it. So Labour gets walloped kind of belatedly. Probably should have happened in 2017, but the level of scrutiny from the electorate wasn't as high. It's a 1983 style hammering in terms of number of seats. And the best way to understand what then happens in the leadership election is two things: that the members, that there's a big slice of members of the Labour Party who are extremely left-wing and idealistic. They probably profoundly disagree with me on the Israel-Palestine question and on defence and on how many industries to nationalise or whatever. But they also want Labour to win elections. And sometimes they think they can push the left-wing stuff as far as they can get it, and there might be some chance of winning an election. And then the electorate reminds them that it doesn't work, and they will park some of their idealism to go for a more centrist electable leader. But in this instance, because of the history of people like me, frankly, trying to get rid of Corbyn, and that's it being seen from inside the party and that being seen as disloyal, that big middle bit of members were not prepared to go for someone that had been explicitly anti-Corbyn. They went for the person that was most moderate and looked most electorate, but who had served in the shadow cabinet and had appeared to pay lip service to kind of not undermining the leader. I mean, actually, Keir Starmer had resigned in 2016, but he came back pretty soon afterwards. And the hard left of the party don't really have a charismatic successor candidate to Corbyn. I mean, there's a gap in terms of their MPs. They weren't getting many MPs during the 90s and the noughties, are we supposed to call them, the decade at the start of the century. So there was a gap between their older and their younger MPs, and there wasn't a viable candidate, to the extent that there was even a bizarre incident where Barry Gardiner got phoned up and asked if he would stand to be leader of the Labour Party at one point during all this. And they run Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's not particularly strong and was defeated relatively easily. How would I characterize where that leadership election landed the Labour Party is a kind of so it's not a victory for the right wing or the Labour Party. The base of support for Keir Starmer, I supported him. I'm on the right of the party. Some other people did, but he also had some people from the left that had fallen out with the Corbynites who backed him, and a lot of people from what I'd call the soft left, which is like the non-Corbynite left of the party. So he's it wasn't a straightforward, not like some restoration of Blairism. It's more nuanced than that. And you don't, when you take control of the Labour Party, not all the bits of where the power, it's not like the leader comes in and they control everything. They control an awful lot, and they influence other bodies in the party, for instance, by appointing some people to the national executive. But I mean, I was on the opposite end of this, trying to resist the Corbynite takeover, and we held on to the party conference for 2 years, to the National Executive Committee for 2 years, and to the General Secretary for 2.5 years. So you can fight a defensive battle, and that would have been my assessment on the 4th of April, was of a kind of very incomplete victory. Where is Keir himself coming from on the specific issues that we're interested in tonight of anti-Semitism and of Israel? So in terms of some personal background, Starmer is not Jewish, but his wife, the phrase he uses is from a Jewish family, which I take it to mean that she's not necessarily particularly religious, but his in-laws, his parents, her parents are observant. I think they go to the liberal synagogue in St. John's Wood. So he certainly knows more about the community than you would expect for the average Labour MP, and has more personal connections to it. And some of his wife's family live in Israel. So his starting point on Israel is not of automatic hostility. It's like, oh, that's where some of my in-laws live. His support base also included people like Sir Trevor Chin, who's a very high-profile philanthropist within the Jewish community, was the second largest donor to Keir Starmer's campaign. So there's a kind of relationship of trust there with people that are high-profile within the community. And his main strategist, and the guy that's now his chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, is someone that stood on College Green outside Parliament for the Enough is Enough demonstration with his wife and child, and with other people from the Lambeth Labour Party, and whilst is not deeply engaged with this set of issues, is someone that profoundly cares about it and was profoundly disturbed by what was going on. I would say, in terms of Keir's own positioning in the party, he's like someone that came out of the left. He was on the left when he was a young man in the 1980s, was involved in all the main kind of left-wing causes. There's not a lot of evidence that actually the Palestinian cause was ever one of the ones that he was involved in, which is quite surprising, given that his CV reads like having been involved in every, the miners' strike, you name it, all the big events of the 80s he was doing pro bono legal advice for. And I would say he's kind of landed now on the soft left of the party. So he's not from the Blairite right of the party, or even the traditional pre-Blairite right of the party, but he's definitely not from the Corbynite hard left, the group of people that are obsessively anti-Israel. He's kind of somewhere in between the two. So I don't think that he wakes up obsessed by Israel, and I certainly don't think that he wakes up obsessed by Jews. Now let's have a little quick look. How am I doing for time, Spencer? Am I doing okay? I'm taking the head shake.
I said 40 minutes to an hour.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll plow on for a bit. So let's have a look at specifically at some of the things that he's said. So on anti-Semitism, he shouldn't have been saying anything because he was in the shadow cabinet. I mean, he should from our point of view. He should have resigned from the shadow cabinet, probably from our point of view. But from the point of view of the way political parties work, you're not supposed to step out of line if you're in the shadow cabinet. And he was already engaged on another front in a kind of internal war about Brexit, where he was pushing a more pro-European position than Corbyn. But he did speak out on 2 occasions. There's a bit of a urban myth that he said nothing about anti-Semitism. Actually, if you go away and just Google it, you find the stuff that he said, and he didn't hide it either. This was in one case on national TV, on I think Andrew Marr, and the other case on the Today programme. So this is very deliberate. This is a guy that chooses what he says very carefully, and he chose to speak out on it twice. So in the summer of 2018, when there was the huge row, when Labour was being dragged kicking and screaming to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and Corbyn was trying not to adopt the whole thing, not to adopt all the examples, because Corbyn wanted to be able to say that it wasn't anti-Semitic to compare Israeli behavior to the Nazis, when actually I think that's pretty much the most anti-Semitic thing that you ever see anyone do, the most hurtful thing to Jewish people. And he also wanted to be able to say that Israel was a racist endeavor, that the whole idea of Zionism was inherently racist. Starmer goes on national media and says, no, it's not up to us. We don't get to define anti-Semitism. Jewish community and Jewish communities globally get to define it, and the IRA definition is here, and it's as good a definition as any, and we should adopt the whole thing, which is actually quite undermining of Corbyn's position at the height of the debate. And then in 2019, Starmer talks about changing the Labour Party's rules to automatically expel people where there is prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism, which is quite different from the attitude of the Corbynite left, which is to try and find excuses for people a lot of the time, to spin it out and go through amazing convoluted processes before anyone gets expelled, and then frankly to look at the politics of the people, how proximate are these people to the leader's office? I would try and protect them if they're our close allies. So it's the opposite of that, to say that people should be kicked out immediately. Then during the leadership election, he signed up to the 10 pledges on anti-Semitism that the Board of Deputies presented to him. And then this is the interesting bit. There were 2 deputy leadership candidates, Dawn Butler and Richard Bergen, who, sorry, I'm just going to have a sip of water, who didn't sign those pledges. And he said he didn't appoint either of them to any position, not even to deputy vice chair of the PLP Paperclips Committee. Didn't give them any front bench position, even though they'd run for deputy leader. And he said he didn't give them positions because he couldn't put anyone into the front bench who hadn't signed the board 10 pledges, which is quite decisive, and happened within 2 or 3 days of becoming leader. On Israel, the picture is more mixed, so but not particularly disturbing. I mean, certainly nothing like Corbyn era stuff. So the Jewish Labour movement hustings, people were asked, do you consider yourself a Zionist? And the run of the answers was really quite surprising, because Lisa Nandy, who is the chair of the Labour Friends of Palestine, said that because she believes in a 2-state solution, her take is that makes her a Zionist. That's my take on it as well. But it was surprising for her to say it. And then even more surprising was that Rebecca Long-Bailey, who was the Corbynite candidate for the leadership, says, I believe that Israel should exist, therefore that makes me a Zionist. Keir's answer was more disappointing because it sort of prevaricated a bit. So he said, I'm sympathetic to Zionism, I'm supportive of Zionism, I have family in Israel. And then he said, but I wouldn't use that word to describe myself. I don't know why he couldn't, but he didn't. And then a couple of days later, the position sort of pivots to one which presents him in a better light from our perspective, which is that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign comes up with their pledges, half a dozen pledges around forms of targeted BDS and absolute right of return for all descendants of Palestinian refugees. All the other leadership candidates sign it, and Starmer, despite immense pressure, including through the trade unions, refuses to sign it. I'm not clear whether that's because he thinks there's elements of the pledges that are not correct to sign, or whether it's PSC as an organisation that he considers that they're extreme and doesn't want to be associated with them. My take is on the Israel stuff is that he will end up in a kind of Ed Miliband type position. So on the one hand, that's like, well, actually Ed Miliband quite annoyed the community with some of the position that he took on Israel and how critical he was of Israel. And that's not great. That's not Tony Blair, or Gordon Brown being a passionate friend. But compared to where we were with Corbyn, I can kind of live with it. I do think it means that it is unlikely that Labour will invest political capital, that the leadership will try and invest political capital in changing the party's policies. So there have been a couple of negative policy changes under Corbyn towards settlement boycott and towards an arms embargo. I don't think that the leadership will be able to change those at the party conference, but it could be, because not everything that's been passed by a party conference makes it into the manifesto. The wording around that quietly gets dropped in the next manifesto. I think that's kind of more likely, that we don't get the symbolic victory, but come the next general election, that's not part of the policy package. And I do think, I don't think this will be limited actually to Labour. I think the Conservatives could be quite critical. If the Netanyahu government moves towards annexation, then I think that the Labour Party, even under this new leadership, will be extremely critical of that. Maybe that's it's probably another question for another night, but I don't think there will be any kind of soft touch in terms of the Labour response to that. Things that have happened since the leadership election: he wrote a letter to Marie van der Zyl, the president of the board, on the afternoon on which he was elected. An extremely warm and very well written letter. That's highly symbolic. That's deliberate. And then he engaged with the JLC, the board, and the CST as the three kind of lead communal organisations on this stuff. Engaged with the chief rabbi and engaged with the Jewish labour movement, all within about the first week. You then have this extraordinary incident where Starmer had talked about unity and kind of, let's not fight each other anymore. The left's response to that, rather than kind of try and work out if they have anything in common with him, is the leak of their unpublished 800-page subsidiary response to the Equalities and Human Rights Council on Labour anti-Semitism, which is leaked and is going to cause all kinds of legal problems because it leaked a bunch of people's names into the public domain and personal information about them, and it also libeled quite a few people. But it's an extremely elaborate, though clumsy, attempt to smear all the people that were whistleblowing on anti-Semitism. So all the people that worked in the Labour Party's compliance office and became whistleblowers for Panorama. It makes out that they were either lazy or incompetent or deliberately obstructive, and it's their fault that anti-Semitism happened. And then it goes into this very convoluted stuff based on people's WhatsApp messages about how unpleasant all of the moderate people that were running the party machinery were, and that they were so factional and obstructive of Corbyn that that's where all this has come from. So this was an attempt to kind of explode the party a week into Starmer's leadership. And then you've had other provocations like Diane Abbott and Belle Ribeiro Addy, who's an MP that's close to her, going on a Zoom call with the Jewish Voice of Labour, which is the Corbynite kind of very small fringe group of anti-Zionist Jews, and sharing platforms with people that have been expelled from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism, which is against the Board of Deputies' pledges, but Starmer wasn't able to expel them because the rule book of the Labour Party hasn't been changed yet. The most profound thing that's happened really is that the incomplete victory turned out to be a little bit more complete, because there were other elections in the Labour Party held at the same time as the leadership election, by-elections for the party national executive, which no one thought that the moderates could win. Starmer didn't position himself as an out-and-out moderate, but people from the faction that I'm involved in running, Labour First, won those two by-elections, which suddenly gives the leader not the hostile national executive that he'd expected to work with, but one that he can almost always win, that's very near one vote off of a moderate majority. This in turn, he then takes a huge gamble on, he manages to somehow engineer Jenny Formby, the Corbynite General Secretary of the Labour Party, so the person in charge of the party structures and all the disciplinary processes. He somehow persuades her to retire or resign when we thought she was going to hang around for a long time and be a little bit obstructive. And there's already been an election for a new General Secretary where, instead of going for a compromise candidate or one from the middle bit of the party, whether you might expect him to, he promotes a candidate called David Evans, who is very much a kind of Blairite, associated with all of the people running the party machinery in the heyday of Blairism. Also has very good personal politics dating back to his student days in the 80s on the issue of anti-Semitism, and runs this quite controversial candidate who could have lost, but who wins a narrow victory. And so the command of the party structure, all of the major points of power in the Labour Party are now held by people that are not from the Corbyn tradition. I'm going to end by saying what is on the horizon. Very, very soon, the Equalities and Human Rights Council, the Commission, the EHRC, will do its official this is a government quango, the UK's watchdog on anti-Semitism, on racism and other equalities issues. The Corbynites have already conceded in their leaked report that the EHRC is going to say that the Labour Party was institutionally anti-Semitic in the way that it treated its Jewish members. It is quite extraordinary that they conceded that after denying it for 4 or 5 years. They denied there was any problem at all back at the time, pre-Chakrabarti. They then kind of say it's just a small kind of instance of it. And then, and now they're saying, oh, yeah, it happened, but we blame those evil Blairites for it happening. But this is going to be a huge moment in terms of national cut through of an issue. Only the BNP has ever been found to be institutionally racist before of political parties. And Starmer has already signalled through his press secretary said, issued a statement when Corbyn said his stuff about the EHRC last week. Starmer said that he will be accepting all the recommendations, which will include a bunch of stuff about rule changes that are required. But I think that Starmer will be trying to change the culture as well. And there have already been lots of expulsions. It's like people that it is the previous machinery is saying, oh, it takes, you don't understand. We have to go through all these processes. It takes years. How are we possibly supposed to deal with this? You've got to understand how slow this all is. There are people who have gone from suspension a fortnight ago, and this is in all the places you would expect it to be. Some of this was reported in the JC last week: Liverpool Wavertree, Liverpool Riverside, Hastings, High Peak, all the places where there have been high-profile stories. Key individuals have been suspended and under investigation. Well, one of the key people in Brighton, the former partner of Mr. Tony Greenstein, who's pretty notorious on these issues, was expelled today. It took a fortnight because the will is there, the political will, the culture to deal with it, and the desire to deal with it has changed. The other cultural change I think you'll see is just the membership of the Labour Party is changing. So my friend John Speller MP always reminds me, he puts in his daily emails that where he sums up the news, anything about the Corbynites, it says THGA. They haven't gone away. So they haven't gone away, and they're still embedded in bits of the party, but the composition of the membership has changed positively because 120,000 people joined in order to vote in the leadership election, and the best estimate is 90% of them didn't want to vote for a Corbynite. So there are lots of new or returning members with a different attitude, and that will feed into what it feels like if you go back to a Labour Party meeting. It won't immediately be perfect, but there is a chance that it will be better. And some of the worst people are either being suspended and expelled or are choosing to go because they don't want to hang around in a Labour Party where they're not in the driving seat and where they think that all of the revolting things that they want to say about Jews and Israel will be scrutinised and could lead to their expulsion. They're just going to go, well, I'll feel a lot happier in the Socialist Workers' Party or in a single issue group. But the key thing that I've always said is this is about the personnel changes are absolutely what's important. We did change the rule. We being allies of Jews and Jews in the Labour Party did, even from a minority position, get better rules implemented in the Labour Party in 2017 and 2018 to make anti-Semitism an offence in the rule book and to define it with the IRA definition. But like in the old days of the Soviet Union, where they had a constitution that elaborated 101 or 110 different freedoms that you had as a Soviet citizen, but because Stalin and Brezhnev were in charge, actually it didn't matter what the constitution said. It's a bit like that. If you've got a perfect constitution that defines anti-Semitism and says you should be expelled for it, but the people who are judging whether you've been anti-Semitic or not are the political allies of anti-Semites and don't wish to take effective action against them. Well, the important thing is to change the personnel. And so the General Secretary has changed the composition of the NEC, which deals with a lot of disputes and disciplinary changes, processes has changed. And now I would expect to see that change flowing down through the organisation into the people that are dealing, both staff and elected people that are dealing with disciplinary matters inside the party. And you can see that even just changing the top management has started to speed up the process. So I guess I would say my overall position is optimism about immediate effective action being taken, pessimism that Pandora's box on anti-Semitism was opened by Corbyn and his associates, and it will not wholly disappear from the British body politic and public life, because these concepts, these revolting tropes and concepts and conspiracy theories and stuff are out there and people have heard them and they've sunk into people's minds. And then on the Israel side of stuff, I would say the party will be less prone to delegitimization. I think the party leadership will try to avoid at all costs, debates about Palestine with people waving Palestinian flags on the conference floor. That isn't the image of the Labour Party they're looking for. But I don't think we're going to see some kind of huge embrace of Zionism or the kind of more robust pro-Israel stance that I would personally take. I don't think that's realistic to expect that jump in one go. So we will need to continue to put pressure on the Labour Party to understand that there are people in the UK that care about Israel and expect Labour to adopt at the very least a balanced attitude. I think we can expect more balance, but perhaps the levels of criticism we might still find rather grating. At that point, I'm gonna stop talking because I'm conscious I've spoken for a long time, and I'm happy to try and answer some questions.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Lucas very kindly said that he'll take questions from you. So if you'd like to speak, could you put up your virtual hand or indicate to Phil that you'd like to speak?
So we've got a few questions in the chat, which maybe we'll start with.
Right.
If anyone else wants to add questions, you can either put them into the chat or, as Spencer said, you can just highlight on the screen. So first question, we have been bombarded from all sides. Israel, Jews being blamed for the George Floyd event. It feels overwhelming. What can we as lay people do? Where should we concentrate our energies? Okay,
so I hadn't picked up on that of kind of blaming of. I'd seen Jenny Tong do a comparison between the dreadful incident that happened in the States and like a picture of an Israeli soldier, allegedly a picture of an Israeli soldier. I don't know if it was accurate, with a knee on a Palestinian. I'm not surprised, because whenever the nature of anti-Semitism is it mutates, and whenever bad things happen in the world, there are people that blame Jewish conspiracies or find a way to blame Israel. And I know that there's been some reports that have been done globally about conspiracy theories being propagated on the internet about COVID as well. So it's like wherever there's a problem, anti-Semites find a way to pin it on Jews. I would say, the community needs invests an awful lot through CST in sadly in having to protect itself and to be vigilant. I think it is important to understand that even at the height of the Corbyn stuff, these anti-Semitic attitudes and even extreme anti-Israel attitudes are very much a minority. So they're believed by a scarily large number of people, but when I say scarily large, it's like hardcore anti-Israel beliefs, like belief in boycotting or belief that Jews shouldn't have a state. That's about 7% of the public believe that. We know. We do polling on this every year, and actual anti-Semitic attitudes would probably be, I think, are about half that, is the last polling that I could see. So please be assured that I am not the only non-Jew that is there as an ally. Actually, the vast majority of British people have decent views on this, and to the extent lots of British people don't really know very much about Jewish people, either from a positive or a negative viewpoint. But are just kind of decent human beings who don't like to hear about prejudice. And then we know from like the voting patterns, say in the council elections in Barnet, that a lot more people turned out and delivered a bloody nose to Corbyn than there were Jews in Barnet, because people's neighbours who do understand the community and care about it acted in solidarity. So there are people out there who have your back, but don't be complacent, which is why organisations like CST exist. And then I would say the Jewish community has to keep doing what it is best at, which is being punching above its weight in terms of being very vocal, active citizens, of being civically minded as well as internally, communally minded. That's a bit exhausting, because you're asking people to make a commitment to sustaining communal life and communal institutions, and then to go out there into wider British society and municipal life and stuff and be energetic there as well. But Jews are good at doing that and have a very proud history of doing it. And it's I think it's a question of like being there, being vocal, being making the case for the community against anti-Semitism, against anti-Zionism. And I hope that organisations like mine and some of the organisations with a more specific remit about anti-Semitism are kind of there to help provide you with a framework to do that.
The allegation for America was that the Israelis had trained the American police.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be fascinated to discover whether any. It sounds pretty. I think the Israelis have got better things to do with their time than train kind of clearly incompetent and malign police officers in. I mean, because these weren't any special kind of police, were they? It's not like it could have been counter-terrorism police that you could logically expect Israel might have had some interaction with them. I can't think of a logical reason why policemen from Tel Aviv or Ramat Gan or whatever would have interacted with policemen in it wasn't Milwaukee, it was Minneapolis of all.
Minneapolis. Right, next question.
Okay, so we've got a question. Luke highlighted Starmer's comment about expelling members where there's a prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism. Does Luke think that Corbyn should be expelled? Okay,
so I saw that coming up in the chat, and I was thinking, that is quite a difficult question. I do this is going to sound like a get out, but this is a legitimate thing for me to say. I'm intending to stand, you heard it here first, I'm intending to stand to try and get back on the Labour Party National Executive this summer, which would mean that I would potentially be sat on the NEC Disputes Committee looking at individual cases, including potentially high-profile ones. So I would prefer not to comment on individual cases, because then I would have to recuse myself from the vote on those. That's really what happened. Like, people that had ever said anything bad about Ken Livingstone were not, which is almost half the Labour Party, were not allowed to sit on the Ken Livingstone case. So I'm not going to say whether I think he's broken the Labour Party rule book. I am going to say that the comments that he made about the EHRC were wholly inappropriate. When EHRC is about to give a verdict on the behaviour of the Labour Party under his leadership, it is not appropriate for him to have undermined them and suggested that they were not neutral body. That's like, a criminal or potential criminal undermining the authority of the judge and the jury, and that if we're talking about questions to do with anti-Semitism, which usually revolves around conspiracy theories, questioning the neutrality and the political control of a statutory body is not a great look. I mean, I just think it's fact. In a way, it's like the mask has kind of dropped. The Corbyn that we were seeing before December the 12th, to some extent, his language was mitigated because he had a set of advisors and media handlers around him who were telling him to put a sock in it. And now that he's just speaking for himself, we're getting to see the full extent of where he's coming from.
Okay, so a related question: do you know when the EHRC is due to present its findings?
So we being the organisation that I'm involved in on the Labour side of things, Labour First hosted a Jewish Labour movement call about anti-Semitism last week, where the officers of JLM said they were expecting it in the next couple of weeks. I mean, I've had people say to me they thought it could be the end of this week, but I gather this is on the very near horizon. And I imagine that's why Corbyn, he was getting his rebuttal in early.
Okay, ready. All right, thank you. One last question that's in the chat, and then we'll go to any questions that anyone's got on the call. Do you think the influx of new Corbynite MPs at the last election, together with the remaining Corbynistas in the PLP, will continue to exert malign influence on the party?
Sorry, so that because you broke up a little bit. Then do I think the kind of this is like
repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah, that's fine. Do you think the influx of new Corbynite MPs at the last election, together with the remaining Corbynistas in the PLP, will continue to exert malign influence on the party?
So it's certainly not help. First thing I would say is it's extraordinary the lengths that they went to get a few extra hard left MPs. Everything they'd always accused the Labour establishment of around kind of clamping down on member democracy and the rights of local constituency parties to pick their candidates, they threw out the window all of their traditional talk about internal party democracy and literally stitched up selections up and down the country. I mean, Bassett Law, the one for John Mann's successor, which Labour in the end didn't win. The woman that won, I mean, she won it fair and square and was the choice of the local members. And then they removed her as candidate on the most spurious grounds. And then they did things like short lists of only 2 people, only one of whom they thought was robust in various places. A prime example of that is Coventry South with Zara Sultana, who has extremely bad political track record on issues to do with when she was in NUS on issues to do with anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. So they did everything they could. They then ended up in net terms with about the same number of hard left MPs, but in a smaller PLP because their own political strategy, imploded the Labour Party's electoral chances. They do have a little bit more influence, but not enough to actually cause a leadership challenge. It means there's a bit of a lack of moderate backbenchers because you need about 100 MPs to fill all the front bench positions and the whips. And so it means that disproportionately the backbenchers are in a bad place, other than some kind of older people on the moderate side that are in their last term and didn't particularly want to be on the front bench. I think, I named one of them, but there's a handful of young ones, particularly ones with an association with student politics, where they harassed and were vindictive towards the Union of Jewish Students, who then brought that into the PLP. And I'm not sure that they're going to manage not to lose the whip over, because they're coming from such an extreme place, and they're going to be so angry about the direction about the party going in a different direction, and they're quite young and inexperienced politicians as well. So I think that they could mess up, and I think what's going to be more important for Labour's recovery is the kind of quality of candidates that are selected to run in the seats that Labour would need to win to form a government next time. So, I mean, it's difficult for any party to get from 202 seats to a majority, but kind of particularly the easier target ones of those, Labour might win some of them back. And it's going to have more chance of winning those seats back if the people that are fielded for them have some kind of connection to the British electorate in terms of appearing to be on the same political planet and not coming with an extremist baggage. And then that's going to determine the composition of a new, bigger PLP after 2024. So I'm future focused, and I'm thinking what's going to happen with that round of selections, and can the Labour Party get a really good set of candidates? And that's one of the reasons why I've been trying to get back on the National Executive, so that there's some rational oversight of the selection process for those candidates.
Thanks, Luke. I'll say, Spencer, there's no other questions come through. So unless there's any others that you've got directly, possibly.
Any questions?
Oh, yeah, I'll say I can see.
Angela?
Yeah, I can see. So I'm going to go to Stephen Will first, and then I'll come to Angela after that.
Right, he's been unmuted.
Yeah, you're unmuted, Stephen.
We can't hear you.
I'll say. Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Good. Luke,
Yeah.
first, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Really enjoyable and a great rumbling through. I have a question on theory, really, in terms of pure socialist thought processes.
Yeah.
And you're obviously someone of a moderate wing. From someone who believes that they're following the true party line, the true belief in socialism, aren't there a number of grounds in which fundamentally one has problems with Judaism on one hand, and linked and separately with the existence of Israel?
Yeah.
You're someone who believes in an utopian overall view of mankind behaving well to mankind. If you have Jews who are believing they should in some way be separate, that's straight away an anathema to them. And secondly, if you're from another wing that is a world view that everyone should be nice to each other, the very fact of being nationalist is also something that you're against. Would that be correct, or would you disagree with that analysis from a purist point of view?
Yeah, so I would say that is it depends what you think of as pure socialism. Actually, I would kind of argue that mainstream Western European social democracy of the kind that the German SPD or the Swedish Social Democrats or the British Labour Party Attlee, Wilson, Blair variants, actually that's socialism. And some of the stuff that we're about to discuss, I would say that is kind of communism or an extreme variant. That my version is actually historically been the mainstream and dominant trend, and that kind of
more social democratic, but that's more social democracy.
Yeah, but I've just had a huge argument on Twitter with the president of Oxford University Students' Union, where I've attempted to persuade her that actually the terms democratic socialism and social democracy have been used interchangeably since pretty much time immemorial. And on one level, people want to say, "Oh, you're a social democrat." Like, yeah, I am a social democrat, but I don't think that makes me not a socialist, because my idea of socialism is not the abolition of capitalism. It's a society that where values to do with cooperating and solidarity and caring about poverty and inequality dominant. But anyway, that's a bit of a side story. So I think you're right. One of the bits I didn't touch on when I spoke about the ideology behind this is that I think if you are a doctrinaire Marxist-Leninist, so I'm using this very carefully because I think you could be there are Marxists who might be in an okay position on this, but if you are Marxist-Leninist, you believe that imperialism is the highest form of capitalism and comes just before capitalism collapses, and therefore that the world we live in must be end state capitalism, must be imperialist. Well, there aren't empires with the Union Jack flying over them anymore, so you have to try and pin that label on somewhere, and you pin it on Israel and say that it's a colonial project, a bunch of Europeans that have kind of been transported. You ignore all the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and all of the Sephardis who lived there the whole time anyway, or whatever, and you talk about it being a kind of European colonial project. It's not clear there whether the conspiracy theory is that the colonial powers are telling the Jews to do it, or the Jews are getting the colonial power. One way or the other. We're back into conspiracy theories. And then there's also this sort of sense of that if you believe as a Marxist-Leninist that, even as a Marxist, that the history of all hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggle, and that's what history is about. It's not about religions. It's not about tribes. It's not about great men or women. It's about the struggle, the economic struggle between classes that then resolves itself in a revolutionary situation, and you move forward to the next stage of history. Well, you look at people whose primary identification is as a Jew, whether that's cultural or religious or ethno-religious, and you go, well, they're not supposed to believe that anymore. They're supposed to identify as a proletarian, and so that they get involved in class struggle until they forget all this Jewish stuff and spending their Tuesday nights at education sessions at Edgware United Synagogue, and they get down the local communist hall and start spending their evenings being politically educated by Graham Bash or someone, or Tony Greenstein, that we're not going to be able to advance history. So I think you're completely right that this is like deeply ideologically rooted, and it particularly the sort of the two guys that I mentioned, both of whom I once said to Graham Bash when we were handing out leaflets outside Labour Party conference, because we know each other from Hackney, and before all the Corbyn stuff, we actually kind of got on reasonably well. And I said to him, so Graham, are you a Bundist? Because I keep hearing about Bundists. And he said, well, I prefer Bundists to Zionists like you. And then he went, actually, I'm not a Bundist, I'm a Bolshevik. These people literally identify with the Russian Revolution in 1917 and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, was it the Yevskaya, the people that the Leninists sent round to like smash up the synagogues and chase the rabbis out of town and persuade everyone to go down the communist hall and talk about communism instead. And that because they have abandoned very much of their Jewish identity, they don't go to shul at all. It's become a purely cultural thing around the occasional bowl of chicken soup or whatever. They kind of look at all of you who are either more observant or even in a secular way more involved in the community, and they're like, well, why haven't that's deeply frustrating for them. They can't understand why you haven't moved on. They can't understand why you feel this affinity to Israel, for instance. Good question. And when I do the longer version of my talk about the ideological stuff, I tend to touch on this. And it's the other thing to understand about it is it's like an all-encompassing theory of how the world works. It's like a substitute religion. It's like if you are a Marxist-Leninist, you have a out-of-the-box description of how people interrelate with each other, how the economy works, how relationships between countries work, how society works. And then if things superficially don't look like they fit into that, it would destroy your entire worldview. So you have to force things like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is actually incredibly complex and huge roots in history and religion and nationalism and all kinds of complexities and interrelationships. You try and force it into a paradigm that makes it just part of a global history of class struggle.
Thank you.
Others, their heads explode if they actually are confronted with the reality that the world doesn't fit neatly into patterns like that.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for the question, Stephen. Was it Angela Spencer you said you have a question?
Angela,
okay. Let's try and unmute her. time here.
Yeah.
I say, Angela, can you? Oh, she's just gone. She's just gone. All right, we'll come back.
Run away to find the question.
We'll come back to her. So I've got a few others who've put their hands up virtually. So I don't know if that's Les or.
Yes, yeah. I just want to ask you. I know Seamus Milne was a big supporter and advisor to Corbyn. What's happened to him now, and how is he taking the downfall of Corbyn?
So, my understanding is that he, so definitely not the. Can everyone hear me? By the way,
Yes.
yeah. He definitely isn't the chief media advisor to the new leader of the Labour Party. There was a story circulating that he would somehow stayed on the party payroll for a bit longer, but now that the general secretary has changed, he will disappear off back to the Guardian fairly fast, I would imagine. I mean, I know that he's not the not seen as the biggest hero in the community, but Tom Watson did a podcast a couple of days ago where he really laid into Seamus Milne and Andrew Murray, the guy from who was Corbyn's other advisor from a Communist Party background. It was just like, what were these people ever doing as members of the Labour Party when they had been involved not just in not in the nice bit of the communist. I'm not sure there was a nice bit of the Communist Party, but it's like they were not Euro communists. They're not people like Sue Slipman and David Aronovich that were kind of trying to reconcile communism with democracy. These were tankies, Andrew Murray and Seamus Milne. These are people that believed in the worst excesses of like the Brezhnev doctrine of going into Prague and Budapest and have written reams of stuff whitewashing Stalin. So it's kind of no surprise that they then whitewash anti-Semitism, because if you whitewash Stalin, you're going to do that. These are people with really fundamentally unpleasant politics. It's nothing to do with democratic socialism or social democracy. And I find the idea that my membership subs paid them to sully the offices of the leader of the Labour Party for several years. I mean, it's horrifying, and how the party kind of. I mean, the party is moving on, but it's going to take a long time to kind of wipe clean the spot of allowing people with that kind of grotesque politics near to the centre of power within.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Angela's gone again. I was about to say, Angela. Right, we'll come back. So Jane, let me unmute. Jane. Hey, Jane, you on?
Hello, Luke. Thank you very much for. I've heard you talk before, and I've been to your conferences, and I just wish we had more Luke Akehursts out there. And it's wonderful hearing a non-Jewish person be so supportive of Israel and Jews. Very short question, Jenny Tong. Has she? I know she's an independent peer. Is there anything that can be done to reprimand her for some of her abhorrent views?
Yeah. So I mean, it's like the. So I mean, the irony here is. When I first started working for We Believe in Israel, it was Lib Dems that were this is only 10 years ago. We didn't think there was that big a problem in that. I mean, we knew there were some bad people like Corbyn, but they seemed completely fringe. And actually, it was David Ward and Jenny Tong were the two people that the community was most exercised about. So, to the credit, the Lib Dems have somehow engineered getting her out of the party. So she sits as an independent. I mean, I think she is unhinged. She's obsessive, and she can't even hide it in the way in which some of the ones on the Labour side like hide it and dress it up politically. She just will say, I mean, it's her that she did stuff like the organ harvesting in Haiti or whatever, didn't she? That's like the really deranged stuff. There is a mechanism for people having life peerages removed for gross misconduct. I'm not familiar enough with the rules of the House of Lords of how close to the line she is currently sailing. But I mean, I don't think that it's a great. I mean, I don't think she should be in either House of Parliament because she doesn't put anything rational into the debate. She puts irrationality and hatred into it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Jane. Thanks, Luke. So we've got Malcolm and Gwendolyn and possibly Angela. So Malcolm, unmute me.
Me, darling.
There you are. You're on, Malcolm.
So did you ask me, Malcolm?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Yes, I'd just like to ask a rather simple question. And what worried me most about the Labour Party was the level of anti-Semitism. You know, as a Jew growing up in this country, one was used to sort of a benign background, and people like Somerset Maugham or Agatha Christie put a little bit of stuff in their writings, but it wasn't anything that would worry you too much. But with all the stuff with the Labour Party, I felt quite frightened, particularly I think it was when Luciana Berger gave a talk in Parliament. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think sadly you were probably right to be frightened, because there's a difference between when this is people who appear to be exhibiting both a very extreme variant of anti-Israel discourse, and in some cases they're lapsing over into kind of classical anti-Semitism, like the stuff around the mural in Tower Hamlets that portraying kind of Jews
yes
on a monopoly board or whatever. That wasn't nothing to do with Israel. That was like a whole other set of classical anti-Semitic stereotypes. And there's a difference between that when it's like a fringe trot group selling newspapers outside a tube station, which, because the SWP have propagated this sort of politics for 40 years or whatever, and when it's people running the main opposition party and putting themselves forward to have state power. That was the frightening bit. I mean, personally, given some of the, so I get a load of abuse. I mean, I get some stuff that is, even though I'm not Jewish, it could be CST might construe it as being anti-Semitism because it's talking about he's funded by Mossad or whatever. And I'm not sure all the people that throw that at me online know that I'm not Jewish. But I also get, even if you strip that out and there was no issue to do with Israel, I would get quite a lot of abuse from some of these people just for being a moderate in the Labour Party. So I was scared of the idea of letting a bunch of people that seem to have anger and hatred and animosity at the heart of their politics near to the levers of state power. And it's kind of the electorate denied them that, and now the internal Labour Party electorate is starting the process of, I mean, rather faster than I'd expected them to. Actually, I didn't expect us to have a good new general secretary in 7 weeks and stuff, but they're starting to be marginalised in the Labour Party. But I don't think it is irrational to have been afraid, and I think, sadly, the lesson of Jewish history is that the people that were afraid made the right call in previous episodes where Jews encountered anti-Semitism, and I'm just glad that we're not we're not dealing with that scenario of potentially people with very repugnant views holding governmental power at the moment. And actually, I'm also glad because it means we can get back to the British people not having that offered up as one of the alternative forms of government, because I think it was kind of pernicious for democracy to present people with like a Hobson's choice, like putting people in a situation where they might really dislike what Boris Johnson stands for on a whole range of issues, economy, Europe, public services, but they kind of felt that they had to vote for him because the alternative was unpalatable, not good for democracy.
Absolutely.
Better to have two parties, both of which wouldn't be a disaster for the country.
Yes, I agree completely. Thank you. Yes, yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you. We've got one last question then, Spencer, from Gwendolyn Lamb.
So it did work.
I'm just trying to see if I can.
Right.
There we go. Gwendolyn, you're on.
Hi.
Thank you. I totally agree with you, Luke, as to what you said about Baroness Tong. I think the sooner she loses her peerage, the better. I only wish we could do something about it. The point that I wanted to comment on, or if you could make a comment on it, please, not so much a question as what worries me, is that LSE and the Oxford Union tend to be very anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and they are going to be the politicians of the future. Is there anything can be done about that? Because I'm very worried. People coming from the Oxford Union are our future politicians, and from LSE, that's the breeding ground.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is so anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Have you got any comment to make on that?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of my time at We Believe in Israel trying to deal with campus issues and be supportive to UJS, and that's where my own background was in student politics. That's how I got into this issue as a non-Jew, was by building alliances with Jewish students back in the 90s.
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right, because all the people that I was involved in NUS with who built those alliances with UJS, they ended up being Labour MPs, and some of the friends that the Jewish community has had over the last 5 years were because people spotted that there were people that they should engage with. So it's hugely important to win debates on campus, and important to take, not to be just. I think when I just spoke about a couple of the new, very Corbynite Labour MPs, they've come straight out of NUS, like only 1 or 2 years ago. So it's not just that the politicians of the far future; they're the politicians of the immediate future. Where I would I would say UJS does a fantastic job, both on combating overt anti-Semitism, calling it out. So, like my old university, Bristol, there's that revolting guy, Stephen Miller, who's actually not a student, is a lecturer in sociology, who puts up conspiracy theorist stuff. And the JSOC took direct action to protest against him. I think he's been suspended by the university now. But up and down the country, UJS do that, and they debate again on campus whenever there's like boycott motions or anything anti-Semitic. They step up. I think that's hugely courageous, actually, because these are kids that should be just enjoying their degree, but they have to take time out from it to become very politically engaged and understand how student unions work. And I would say the thing is reversible. So I'm thinking less of, I live in Oxford. I'm speaking to you now from my front room in Oxford, so I particularly get to see what's going on amongst the students there.
Oxford Union,
I would differ. There have been like invitations to the anti-Semitic Prime Minister of Malaysia and stuff by the union.
That's right.
But things can change, because the Labour Club in Oxford was the start of public understanding of Corbynite anti-Semitism. Was Baroness Royal's report into the Oxford University Labour Club and the complaints from Jewish students about anti-Semitism and about people singing songs about rockets over Tel Aviv or whatever. The new generation, because that's 4 years ago, so there's a totally different set of students. The students that are running the Labour Club in Oxford now, they're very left-wing on economic stuff, on anti-austerity and stuff. They're way to the left of me. I mean, it was actually someone from Oxford University Labour Club that I was having this argument about whether I counted as a socialist or not on Twitter over the weekend.
Yeah.
But they're all really good on the Jewish students. Probably not that great on, some of them not that great on Israel. But they've learned, because of what the predecessor group of students were like, to express their criticism of Israel in a way that isn't anti-Semitic, and on the basics of understanding what anti-Semitism looks at, they're in a different place. And I imagine that some of that has been due to outreach work by UJS. So any of you that have kids or grandchildren who are students, do show support for them. I think UJS is like one of the most fantastic institutions that your community has, or any community, because it isn't just that they're fighting these political battles, they're also enabling people to connect with Israel, to have Friday night suppers, to have a Jewish social life, and religious life while they're at university, and get kosher food and welfare and everything else. UJS is a really, really fantastic organisation that everyone should express support for.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay, Spencer.
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
Well, our next live stream session will be on Tuesday, the 30th of June, when Richard Cohen, the great nephew of Sir Jack Cohen, will be speaking on Sir Jack Cohen and 100 Years of Tesco. And we all know that he was right. And we all know that he was a Jewish capitalist.
Yeah.
Right. So if you could take the hair off the screen for the moment now.
Yeah.
Right. So it remains for me to thank Luke for giving us the historical background to what is happening in the Labour Party, explaining the sectarian divide within the party, and giving us an informative analysis of current developments. I think one of the losers as a result of the change have been the political satirists. I mean, the sort of thing that I've heard, that Corbyn stopped going to his allotment in Islington because it's a Blairite plot. We wish you well in the future, standing for the National Executive, and carry on putting our case. We're most grateful to you, Luke. Thank you very much.
For having me.
Thank you very much. Can you unmute us and we'll give the usual applause?
Yes, I will do that now. Okay, everyone is unmuted that wants to be.
Thank you.
Okay, I will stop the recording now, but I'll leave the session open for a little bit longer if anyone's got any final comments.
I'm going to leave to go and have my dinner, but it's been great talking to you all.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.